Hey everyone, welcome back to another Thursday night at Home with Olympus. We are kicking off a new month and we are going to be focusing on some wildlife photography this month. And so tonight we have Olympus Explorer Brooke Bartleson joining us to teach us how to break into wildlife photography. So a little housekeeping as always. Yes, this is being recorded, and yes, you can watch it on the replay. It'll be on both Facebook and YouTube as soon as this broadcast ends. And we will have a Q&A session towards the end. So if you have really great questions that you want to ask Brooke as we go through her presentation, make sure you ask those questions at the end, and we will bring them up on the screen and get some answers out of Brooke. For now, let's welcome Brooke to the show. How's it going, Brooke?
Hey, Michelle, it's good to be here. Thank you so much, everyone who's joining. I'm super excited to talk with y'all tonight about all things wildlife photography.
Yes. Where have you been lately? I've seen you on the road constantly. Where's your last place you left?
Last place I just left was Montana, like around the Yellowstone area. I drove down through Wyoming past Grand Teton National Park, and now I'm in Salt Lake City. And then in a few hours, I'm actually leaving and going directly to Colorado. So just stopped home for like a couple days to get this done before I continue on to my next adventure. But I was shooting bears up north, and now I'm heading back east to hang out with some foxes for a few days.
Oh, awesome. Well, I'm glad that you were able to find a pause in your travels so that you could share with us tonight. Do you want to give us a little rundown of what we're going to talk about tonight?
Yeah, so we are doing a break into wildlife photography. So this is going to be pretty beginner for some of the concepts. There's obviously still going to be some great takeaways for people who aren't beginners, from anything from amateur to pro level. But I'm going to talk quite a bit about gear, which is not something I usually do. So I'm very excited to dive more into that topic. I'm going to talk about finding subjects, getting a little bit creative about where you might want to be able to shoot. I'm going to talk some compositional tips and some just basic, wildlife photography ethics that I think are always pretty important in these discussions as well. And while I chat, I'll just walk you all through some of the images that I've taken that apply to concepts that we're going to go through. And then at the end, we'll have a Q&A. So it should be pretty good. I think there's going to be some new info, hopefully, for folks who are tuning in tonight.
Awesome. Well, and they're tuning in from literally everywhere. We've got Australia again, you Australians. It's like the middle of the night, right? Thank you for joining us. Thank you. Lots of people from all over. We've got Hawaii, Ohio, San Antonio. There's some people right down the road from me. So people joining from everywhere. We're going to get going as people keep joining on. Feel free to drop where you're from in the comment section. We love seeing where you guys are all from. And again, ask your questions. I'm going to let Brooke go ahead and cue up her presentation for us real fast. And then I'm going to get out of the way because this is not about me. This is about Brooke and breaking into wildlife. So I'll see you guys later. Bye, Brooke. Good luck.
Thank you. All right. Welcome, everybody, to my breaking into wildlife photography discussion that we're going to go through tonight. So quick intro about me. I am Brooke Bartleson. As Michelle said, I'm an Olympus Explorer. I'm loosely based in Salt Lake City, Utah. I say loosely because I'm constantly on the road photographing wildlife pretty much everywhere between Utah, Colorado, Wyoming, Idaho, and Montana are my typical states that I'm roving between. I do have some upcoming travels, one of which is taking me to a new continent. I'll be shooting in Botswana later this summer. And then after that, I'll actually be up in Alaska for a month and a half-ish, shooting in Anchorage area and then down to Juneau. So I included this photo of myself here on my introductory slide. In the past, when I did presentations like this, I would have this epic picture of me standing in front of beautiful mountains with my camera, and the wind was blowing and the lighting was amazing, and it made wildlife photography look maybe a little bit different than it actually is. The reality is that wildlife photography is a lot of sitting around waiting. So I love to include this photo of me sitting around waiting for bears to walk by. And fun part of the story is that the bears never walked by that day. So I have been doing wildlife photography for about 4 years now. I was not always a wildlife photographer. It was sort of a slow transition at first, and then just an all-in change to full-time wildlife photography. I started out doing weddings and elopements. They were fun. I'm definitely not the most people-y of persons, so I did struggle a little bit to feel fulfilled when I was doing that line of work. Then I switched into doing product photography. And at the time, while I was doing these outdoor photo shoots for different outdoor apparel companies and things like that, I was living in Colorado. And I would go out to shoot pictures of, say, a coffee maker in the wilderness or a new tent or hiking boots. And on my way up into the mountains to find these beautiful scenic backdrops, I was encountering a lot of wildlife. And every single time, without fail, if an animal came into my line of sight, I would lose any amount of focus towards the product shoots and could only focus and pay attention to the animal in the vicinity. I've always been a huge animal nerd, so they captured my attention in a way that no other form of photography ever had. So I started out trying to balance the two. And then eventually I realized I was meeting none of my deadlines. I was getting none of my product photography work done. All I ever wanted to do was see and photograph wildlife. So I eventually abandoned my original line of work and transitioned into full-time wildlife photography. I started shooting Olympus about 2 years, or actually maybe less than that, a year and a half into starting to shoot wildlife photography. Pretty early on, I realized the need to ditch my ginormous DSLR and zoom lens that I was using, because a lot of my wildlife photography is very hiking based. And I am by no means like a very strong person. I'm pretty weak, for lack of a better term. So I needed gear that was really lightweight, really small and easy to pack, and stuff that would just go very easily on all of my long overland hikes and treks. So Olympus was one of the companies that I was considering. There were a few that were known for having lightweight gear. And once I picked up an Olympus camera and started shooting with it, I mean, there was no going back. Not only was the gear super lightweight, it's also weatherproof, super durable. I have put my gear truly through the ringer and continue to do so constantly. And it's held up everything I've put against it. Actually, fun fact, one of my Olympus camera bodies and lenses just spent 3 weeks on a tripod all by itself in the woods here in the mountains of northern Utah as part of a motion censored camera trap. And it was rained on. It was covered in pollen and dust and dirt and all the elements. It was mostly uncovered. And it survived the whole test. So that really is a testament to why Olympus cameras were just such a good match for me. And if anyone's interested in seeing any of my additional work, aside from what I'm going to show you guys in this slideshow here, you can find me at Brooke Little Bear on Instagram. That's really my most up-to-date portfolio. I do occasionally post my work on Facebook, but unfortunately, I just don't keep up with it nearly as much as Instagram. So that would be the best place to find me. So without further ado, let's dive in a little bit. So I touched on it a little when I was going through, who I am and what I do, but I want to talk about why choose wildlife photography. And I'm going to talk a little bit about why I chose wildlife photography. And I'm also going to make some assumptions about all of you who are watching this presentation and assume why I think you're probably interested in wildlife photography or why you're already doing wildlife photography. So one of the first reasons is obviously just it's such an adventurous genre. Wildlife obviously exists outside, so most of your wildlife adventures are going to take place in wide open wild spaces, or far-flung destinations, or rugged, beautiful terrain, typically just places that aren't normal things you see throughout your day-to-day life. That sense of adventure was obviously a huge driver for me. Even more than that was just forming a connection with nature. I think that we, for the most part, all of us live lives that are sheltered quite a bit from the great outdoors, often by no choice of our own, right? It's not our faults that we live in developed areas and cities and towns and places where humans dwell. Not everyone is born a feral child running around the woods. But wildlife photography offered a really good reason to get out of human spaces and connect with nature and experience stuff that, like I said earlier, you might not get to experience otherwise in your day-to-day life. Then, of course, there's the love of animals. I'm sure many of you listening right now can relate with this just obsession with animals, whether it's domestic or wild. If it's an animal, if it's got fur or feathers or hooves or paws, I love it. And I'm so interested in it. I think it's one of those things that we kind of nurture in childhood, all of our stuffed animals or our favorite books. They're all these beautiful, adorable caricatures of wildlife. And I think when that's one of your first introductions into the world, it's really hard to shake that childish love of animals. And wildlife photography has been a great way for me to take that childish love and mold it into something much more mature and much more impactful. Now, the fourth reason, which is definitely not the least reason, if anything, it's probably the most, and it sort of encompasses all of the first three reasons, is conservation. And I'm going to talk a lot about conservation over the course of this presentation because I truly believe that wildlife photography and wildlife conservation go hand in hand. And you might not really realize it at first, but the majority of humans don't often get to interact with wild animals. Unfortunately, when you don't get to interact with something or experience it on a very intimate or personal level, it can be hard to care about a thing, right? If it's something that you're unfamiliar with. Well, wildlife photography is a really great way to make animals important to people who might not have the opportunity to see them with their own eyes very often. Through my imagery, I hope that I can make folks in cities or in faraway countries that don't have things like bison or wolves or grizzly bears, I hope that it can make them feel a connection with those creatures, whether it's from the standpoint of, oh my goodness, I hope I can see that animal someday, or just, wow, I'm so lucky to share a planet with an animal like that. And through imagery and interesting work and great stories, you can help people fall in love with animals and people want to protect the things that they love, which is why it's a great way to get people interested in conservation efforts. So, okay, I'm going to talk a lot about gear throughout this presentation, which I mentioned earlier is not something I usually do. I am a strong believer that the best camera is the one you have on you, but I am also going to definitely acknowledge that the biggest barrier to entry sometimes with wildlife photography can be the gear. Telephoto lenses are really a requirement. It's not really something you can get around unless you're really creative or trying some sort of very intensive method of photographing wildlife. But for the most part, a telephoto lens is going to be a necessity. And a telephoto lens is going to be expensive. It's really important, though, to consider the value of the lenses that you're working with and all the different ways that this various gear is going to help you achieve your goal of photographing wildlife effectively, and also a secondary goal of preserving the wildness of your wild subjects. So I'm really going to dive in on all of the great options for wildlife photography gear that Olympus offers and give you guys my personal opinions on each piece, tell you what I shoot with, make recommendations for people depending on what you're going to be shooting, and hopefully it gives you guys a good takeaway for anyone who's considering breaking into wildlife photography. It'll give you an idea of where to start. So we're going to talk about camera bodies first. I primarily use the OMD EM1 Mark III. That is my favorite camera right now in the Olympus lineup. And my secondary backup camera is the OMD EM5 Mark III. But I've also had the pleasure of using a few other Olympus cameras that I think are great options as well. So I'm just going to go through each one, talk about some features and why I love them or why I recommend them, or why for certain people I might not recommend one of the options. So to start out, the OMD EM1 Mark III, like I said, is my favorite camera. It is one of the Olympus Pro level cameras along with the EM1X. I chose the EM1 Mark III over the EM1X primarily, almost entirely, just because of the size of the camera. I'm going to go back to this slide here. So it is the third camera from the left. It's the one to the left, to the left of the EM1 EM1X. So as you can see, just looking at it, it is a tiny camera. I mean, it's not big by any means. It's very small. It's very compact. It's just as light as you would imagine. Compared to the EM1X, it's definitely a considerable size difference, which is what sold me on it completely. I like having gear that can fit in my pockets. I like having gear that barely makes much of a difference on the weight of my pack. So it was just a no-brainer for me. One of the things that the EM1 Mark III and the OMD EM1X offer that the other two cameras I'm going to talk about don't is a certain feature called Pro Capture Mode. And I'll talk more about Pro Capture Mode later in the presentation, but it is a shooting enhancement feature that's only available in those two bodies. As you learn more about Pro Capture, if it's a setting that you really want to explore and think would be helpful for you in your wildlife photography, I definitely recommend looking into getting one of the cameras that offers that setting mode. Now, I mentioned on here that I use the EM5 Mark III as sort of my secondary backup camera. The reason for that is I think, even though I don't believe it's technically one of the pro level cameras, it's more of like an intermediate camera according to Olympus, I think it functions and produces images just as fantastic as anything in the pro level. It is such a powerful little camera. It's also super small and lightweight. It is the second camera from the left on this slide here. So as you can see, it's tiny. I mean, it's a little bit smaller even than the EM1 Mark III. So when I really need super lightweight gear, like when I'm really trying to trim down my pack length or my pack weight, whether I'm going on a long backpacking trip or flying in a bush plane where we have strict weight limits on what could be taken on the aircraft, I opt for that little camera. The only reason that it's not my go-to is because it does lack some of those other features like Pro Capture mode that you can have in the EM1 Mark III and the EM1X. So that's why it's really my backup camera. But I think for anybody who's just getting started or anybody who tries to keep things simple and doesn't like to get into those more crazy, complicated technical shooting modes, it is a fantastic camera option. Now, another really great beginner level camera and a super affordable option is the EM10 Mark IV. This image on this slide was actually taken with the camera that came out right before the Mark IV. So the Mark IV is actually newer than the camera that I used to take this Fox photo here. I asked to borrow one of the EM10 Mark IIIs because I was just interested to see what Olympus offers as a beginner level or intermediate level camera, because I get asked a lot from people who are just considering getting into photography, don't yet want to make the full spring for top of the line gear. They just want to buy something that's affordable and that will still get the job done. So I wanted to test this camera to make sure it would still get the job done, and it absolutely does. As you can see, this image of this fox is super sharp. My settings, I used one of my telephoto lenses to capture the photo. They paired great with the camera body. I actually have the wrong aperture setting listed on here. I have it as f4.0. Oh yeah, I did use a 4.0 aperture. I'm sorry, that's correct. But yeah, it does great. It performs as well as I would ever need any camera to. It just does, again, lack some of the more advanced features that you'll see in the EM5 and the EM1s. So like I said, realistically, the best camera is the one I have on, or the one you have on you. But there are a ton of different options that Olympus offers. And in my opinion, you really can't go wrong with any of these camera bodies. It just comes down to your personal preference. If you're somebody who's a bit stronger than I am or does not have a problem carrying around heavier gear, that EM1X is such a fantastic option, not just for wildlife photography, but for all photography in general. It is truly one of the greatest cameras that I've ever had my hands on. It's just my own preference that I try to keep things smaller, which is why I opted not to have that as my go-to camera. But like I said, if you're someone who's not overly sensitive to the weight options of what you're shooting with, definitely a great one to consider. If you are very sensitive about weight, EM1 Mark III, EM5 Mark III are great for you. And then if you're just looking for something beginner level, that EM10 Mark IV is also fantastic. Now, people tend to talk a little bit more, I think, about camera bodies when they're learning or starting out in photography than they do about lenses. And I don't know why that is, why so much of people's attention is on which camera is going to get them the greater shot. Because in my opinion, the camera body that you're shooting with is actually the least important part of what you've got in your gear bag. I think obviously the camera bodies are, megapixels are important to some degree. The settings are important to some degree. But what's really going to make or break your success is what lens you're shooting with, especially when it comes to shooting wildlife. And that's why telephoto lenses or teleconverters are an absolute must-have. If you're working on a budget, I recommend considering maybe a less expensive camera body, but a more expensive higher level lens. The lens is what's really going to make all the difference. As you can see here, there are a lot of telephoto lens options that Olympus offers. Luckily, I've had the opportunity to shoot with all of them. So I'm going to walk through, give you guys sort of a little bit of background on the situations in which I've shot with each lens, and what my recommendations would be. So one of the best beginner lenses that Olympus offers for wildlife photography is the 75 to 300 millimeter f4.8 to 6.72. That is the lens that I used to take the photo of this mountain goat here on the right-hand side of this slide. Now, these mountain goats were sort of a personal project for me. They're part of a population of mountain goats here in Utah that are known for being incredibly skittish. They are, I believe they're hunted part of the year, or they have been hunted in the past. And as a result, they are absolutely petrified of human beings. Their skittishness really fascinated me. It made me want to do anything that I could to get up where they live and take their photo. But they live high up on some really, really, really rugged terrain. I'm talking like you are essentially rock climbing for certain portions of this mountain scaling. You're traversing razor sharp ridge lines. You've got terrible weather blowing in because you're on that high alpine environment. And it was one of those expeditions where I knew that if I had a lot of weight in my backpack, I wasn't going to make it. My stamina was just barely what's needed to get to where the mountain goats are. And if I had anything weighing me down, my chances of getting up there successfully were slim. I knew that because I'd tried multiple times. And every single time I tried to get up to that summit, I couldn't make it. So I asked to borrow one of these 75 to 300 millimeter lenses because they are by far the smallest telephoto lens that Olympus offers. I put it in my pack. I paired it with my EM1 Mark III. I wanted to sort of offset a little bit of the quality, since it wasn't a pro level lens, which is what I'm used to shooting with. I did want to pair it with a pro level body just to maximize my chances for success. Now, what was pretty amazing about this body and lens setup was I actually did not need to bring a backpack at all. I did the entire climb with that lens and my camera body in my hoodie pocket. I had on a very baggy sweatshirt. It was a men's large to give you perspective on how big the pocket was. And I just stuck my camera and that lens right in that pocket and climbed up that mountain and got to where the goats are. And in my opinion, that lens performed fantastically. And I got some really good, sharp, moody images that I thought portrayed both the goat and their environment really well. So for being a beginner lens, I thought it took great quality images. I will say it is a lens where the focal length, because it's a zoom lens and it's a 75 to 300, you might feel like you need to get closer to your subjects when you're shooting with a lens like this. So if you're somebody who's going to be photographing really big game like bears or anything else that you really shouldn't be approaching, or you're going to be shooting in an area where your subjects are going to be a pretty good distance away from you, it might not be the best option for what you're shooting. But if you're someone who's doing backyard wildlife photography, or you're photographing animals, say birds or chipmunks, squirrels, raccoons, maybe domestic wildlife like your dog or horses or cows or beautiful scenic domestics that live in the area, this might be a really great option. So just sort of a matter of knowing what sort of environment you're going to be shooting with so that you're setting yourself up for success in the best way possible. Now, one of my favorite Olympus lenses and one that I try to have on me as much as possible is the 40 to 150 millimeter f2.8 Pro lens. This is, it's a zoom lens as well. It is one of Olympus's Pro Series lenses. So, just the sharpness of this lens is absolutely astonishing. When it comes to wildlife, it's not really the best focal length for most wildlife photography if you're looking to get really intimate, close-up portrait style photos, but I think it is exceptional for getting environmental style photos of wild animals. So those pictures where your subject is sort of small in frame and the backdrop of the mountains or whatever their environment is what is the highlight of the photo. So I actually try to keep that lens on me along with my primary lens, just so that when I do want to take a photo of a beautiful landscape scene with an animal in it, I have an option. Again, I do think it's a great intro lens for wildlife photography if you're shooting subjects that aren't dangerous or a great distance away. I do think, like I mentioned earlier, if you're trying to photograph things like bears or subjects that are further out, you might not be setting yourself up for success by having that as your primary lens. So just a good thing also to keep in mind. The 300 millimeter f4 IS Pro is the lens that I've shot with for the longest. That was my first lens that I got when I started shooting Olympus, and I used it regularly, almost exclusively, with the exception of occasionally using that 40 to 150 and 75 to 300 up until this past fall. So most of the photos that you're going to see throughout the rest of this PowerPoint were taken with that 300 millimeter f4 IS Pro lens. It's a prime lens, so it is just ridiculously sharp. It is ridiculously small. I've got it actually right here. For a 600 millimeter field of view equivalent, this is just a ridiculously tiny piece of equipment. With the lens head fully extended, it's honestly the exact same size as my forearm. So it's super easy to fit in a backpack. It's actually, occasionally I can fit this even in a hoodie pocket. I swear by this lens. I think it's truly one of the greatest telephoto lenses on the market for wildlife photography across the board. It's also got built-in image stabilization, which means when I'm shooting with this lens, I don't need a tripod at all, especially not when I'm shooting with the EM1 Mark III or the EM5 Mark III, because those camera bodies have such great image stabilization within them. But to have my entire gear kit for a wildlife photography shoot be just this lens with a camera body and no tripod is incredibly freeing. Really enables me to move around as quickly as I need to and as easily as I want to. Another lens from Olympus that came out this past year is the 100 to 400 millimeter f5.6 to 6.3 IS lens. It is not a pro level lens. However, it has an incredibly far reach, one of the farthest reaches of focal length that Olympus offers. I think it's a really great, very awesome all around lens. 100 millimeters to 400 millimeters is such a diverse focal range that you can get anything from those more, zoomed out environmental style shots or those super close intimate portraits. I will say for my purposes, I am not the biggest fan of things that have sort of like a narrower aperture option. For me, I really am big on subject isolation, so very blurry, smooth backdrop with a very sharp subject. So I've struggled to get that effect to the degree that I want with the 100 to 400. Now, that's definitely a personal preference. I have a friend who shoots with this lens, and it's her favorite, her go-to, even over her 300 f4 that she carries with her. So really, it just comes down to your personal style. If you're trying to take those crazy, smooth, high contrast images like I tend to prefer, it's not my favorite choice when you've got a great option like the 300 f4. And then my favorite, the brand new 150 to 400 millimeter f4.5 TC 1.25x IS Pro, which is the longest name for also the biggest and longest Olympus lens. Let me grab you mine to show you. So this is that lens. And ever since it came out this past fall/winter, it has been my absolute number one go-to wildlife photography lens, to the point where I've almost barely touched my 300 millimeter, because this has the focal length that I need for everything I'm doing, just about. It has that built-in teleconverter, which means that I can get this lens up to around 1,000 millimeters without having to use an additional external teleconverter. So that's a crazy amount of focal length in such a small package. And you can see here that this lens head is actually like 1/3 of the length of the lens. So when I take this off, you can see how small this thing really is. You can see that it's pretty lightweight considering I'm holding it effortlessly with one hand. And again, like the 300 millimeter, it has such fantastic image stabilization that I don't need to use a tripod when I'm shooting with this either. Now, obviously, this is not a necessity for all wildlife photographers. It is a very big lens. It is a very powerful lens. The circumstances where you need 1,000 millimeters worth of focal length are honestly pretty rare. Typically, when a subject is so far away that you need that much focal length, there's going to be so much atmospheric distortion, whether it's heat waves or dust particles or insects even, or just general brush, that even if you have the best gear on earth like this lens, you're probably still not going to get a very clear shot of a subject that distant. So it is typically more nuanced situations where you might need a big lens like that. So if you're a beginner, someone who's really just starting to break into wildlife photography, there's no need to dive in head over heels for the 150 to 400 until you get bitten by the wildlife photography bug and become obsessed with it to the point where it's all you want to shoot. Then there are also the two teleconverters that Olympus offers. One's the 2X MC20, the other is the 1.4X MC14. These are both fantastic options if you want to opt for something like the 40 to 150. You can slap a teleconverter on there with it, and that extends your reach significantly. You can go as far as to double it. Or if you have that 300 millimeter f4 and you just want a little bit more reach or a little bit more variety in what you can shoot, it's a great idea to get a teleconverter as well. And I've shot with both of them and can definitely say that they don't really diminish the sharpness of the image to any significant level. I know that some teleconverters by other companies definitely have that reputation, but it's not something that I've ever had to worry about with my Olympus teleconverters. That was the most gear talk I've ever done in one time in my life. Like I said, I'm a strong believer that the best camera is the one you have on you. No matter what you're shooting with, whether it's an iPhone or an EM1X with the 150 to 400 attached to it, the most important thing is your subject and your technique to how you're shooting. So I have these two Fox images here on this title slide for the conversation about finding your subject, because these are two of my favorite photos that I've ever taken in my life. They were taken, subsequently, one after the other. But these photos almost didn't happen. The reason for that was I used to live in Colorado in an area that has a lot of foxes in people's neighborhoods. They're urban foxes. They live under people's houses, in people's driveways. They'll take a nap on someone's hot tub. And they're beautiful and they're wonderful to see. But I definitely have something within me that prefers to photograph wildlife out in nature with natural backdrops, not with backdrops like houses or driveways or roads. So when I was driving home from work one evening, and I saw this mama fox and her kit on my neighbor's driveway, I was so disappointed. I was like, oh my gosh, why can't those guys be out in the middle of the forest? Why are they standing right there on my neighbor's driveway? Nothing about this scene looks natural. This is not my type of subject or opportunity. But then in the back of my mind, I was like, well, when am I going to have the opportunity to photograph a fox again? There's no guarantee I'll easily find a subject this weekend or the next time I go out to shoot. So let me just practice. Take advantage of what's happening right in front of me. Get down on the ground, get out of my car, and try and see what I can make happen. Well, this ended up being one of the most surreal and fantastic photo shoots because of the effect that this black driveway had on the images. People often think that I completely photoshopped the backdrop out of these pictures or that these are captive foxes in a professionally lit studio. These are fully wild urban foxes. The reason why the backdrop is entirely black is because, like I mentioned, they were posing on my neighbor's sloped driveway. So shooting with a super wide aperture blurred that backdrop quite a bit. It was already a very dark blacktop asphalt driveway, so the backdrop was already naturally dark. Then as the sun began to set, it was lighting up the foxes, and the backdrop was cast even more into the shadows from my neighbor's house. Now, I did also smooth out and drop the blacks even additionally when I was editing the photos, but it was so easy to darken that backdrop up just a few stops and have these incredibly unique photos where you're questioning if these are foxes in a studio just because of the way that the lighting and the driveway came together. I use that story to say sometimes you might not have the opportunity to shoot the subject and the scene that you have in mind. So you have to make the opportunity or the best of the opportunities that you do have presented to you. And that leads into the first point in finding your subject is considering and always remembering that nothing is mundane. You might leave your house one day with a grand intention to go find something epic, like a giant bull moose with huge antlers. Or you're on vacation in an area where you know that there's wolves active and you want to go out and take pictures of wolves. Or you want to find that black bear that's been meandering through your neighbor's yard the last 4 days. Or that really rare bird that's been on your list of lifer birds, the bird you've been trying to find for so long. And you're so hyper-focused on finding your target subject that you might overlook the more common or mundane species and animals that you encounter along the way. This image here of this raven, I was actually in position hoping to photograph wolves on this day. I think I spent 11 hours in the field watching this very distant wolf pack hunting elk and hoping that eventually the wolf pack would move closer and closer and closer to the point where I could get some sort of usable image of at least one of the wolves. And that never happened. They stayed so ridiculously distant, and I was getting so frustrated. I felt like I was putting in so much time. This was actually the third day, too, that I'd been in position looking for them. And I was not getting what I was hoping for. But there were all these ravens hopping around. Ravens tend to be in the general vicinity of carnivores because they know that if a wolf or a coyote or a bear or a fox makes a kill, they can swoop down and sort of feed on those carcasses and scavenge a little bit. So there were all these ravens in the area also watching these wolves. And out of boredom, I just turned my camera on one of the ravens. I was laying on the ground and started taking photos of him. And I'd actually never in my life taken a good hard look at a raven before. But as I was taking his picture, I realized that every time he blinked, his eyelid was icy blue, like the brightest blue, as you can see in this photo, like as blue as the sky. So much so that it like kind of startled me and I thought there was something wrong with him. And then I looked at all the other ravens and realized that that was happening with them too. It's called the nictitating membrane. It's the second eyelid that birds have so that they are able to blink and, rehydrate their eye without losing sight of the world around them. And it's in ravens, crazy blue and veiny and very detailed and stunningly beautiful. So I wanted to get a photo. All of a sudden, the wolves were forgotten. I wanted to get a photo of this raven that made him look ginormous, where his bright blue, crazy looking White Walker style eye was visible. So luckily, I was shooting with my EM1 Mark III, and it has that mode that I mentioned earlier called Pro Capture. Pro Capture mode is magic. I don't know. I have no idea how it actually works. I don't know how Olympus made this possible. But what it does is when you're shooting in Pro Capture mode, the camera, the second you push your shutter button halfway down, the camera is recording photos, except it's not writing them to your memory card. So it's just like when you're shooting a burst of photos, you're just holding down on your memory or on your shutter, and you're filling up your memory card with this burst of back-to-back images, hoping that at some point in that burst you captured the behavior or the moment that you were hoping to get a photo of. The behavior might not happen, or you might have still missed the moment, and the next thing you know, you've got 70 images on your memory card that you didn't need, just holding space. So Olympus knows that that's a problem for wildlife photographers and developed this crazy Pro Capture mode where you push down halfway on that shutter button. Your camera is recording images but not saving them until you push the shutter button all the way down. Once you push that shutter button all the way down, you're now telling the camera that the burst of images before and after hitting the shutter all the way, you want saved to your memory card. So it's incredible when you're trying to catch a split second of action, like a bird blinking, or like an eagle taking flight, or a bear catching a fish, or a coyote pouncing to grab its prey, or your dog all of a sudden jumping at the moment that you gave it the command. It's a really great feature and something that I personally can't live without. I almost positively live in Pro Capture mode because I'm always trying to document one specific movement in an animal's motion or one specific moment of eye contact or moment that they lift their paw correctly, whatever I think is going to be the most photogenic. So I use Pro Capture mode to get this really unique and exciting photo of a raven on a snowy backdrop, blinking and showing his bright blue nictitating membrane. And I never would have had that moment or gotten this image if I had stayed too focused on the wolves. So I always encourage people, never consider anything wild mundane. It does not matter what your wild subject might be. If you get creative enough and push it enough, you're going to be able to get a stunning image that presents this animal in a new light and makes them a heck of a lot more interesting than you might even typically think they are. Second piece of advice is look to the skies. Luckily, birds are everywhere, and they're really easy to spot for the most part because they're flying around, doing bird stuff and chirping and tweeting and making all the noise in the world to indicate where they're located. So if you're just trying to start out in wildlife photography and you're not really sure how to find a subject, start with birds. And remember that no bird is mundane. You might have a bald eagle in mind, but if you've got a robin on your bird feeder, start there. If you hear a hummingbird buzzing by towards your neighbor's house, start there. Third is look close to home. You probably have a lot more wild creatures in your backyard than you might even realize. Again, squirrels, chipmunks, raccoons, they're still wild. They're still incredibly impressive if you frame them and compose the shot correctly. Think about what animals you consider almost a nuisance in your backyard. Is it the squirrel that screams every time you go outside to water your plants? Is it the bird's nest that chirps at 4 a.m. every single morning so that you can't get any sleep? Chances are you're more familiar with the animals around your general location than you might even realize, just because of those things that animals do that might be considered a nuisance that all of a sudden become very interesting and exciting when you're trying to take their photo. Next great tip is crowdsource. People remember the animals that they see as they go through their day-to-day life. Animal encounters are very memorable. People love to talk about their exciting animal encounters. How often have you gotten into the office in the morning and you heard someone tell a story about how they almost hit a deer on their way into work that day? Or maybe they did hit a deer last night and it was the worst night ever because now their car is totaled. Remember those stories. Ask where those things occurred. Keep in mind that that's a great place where you can now go and look for, well, one less deer if they did hit the deer, but normal amount of deer if they didn't hit the deer. But again, people using your neighbors and your friends and anybody else, asking them to keep an eye out for you and let you know when they have wildlife sightings is a great way to find a subject, or at least know where to begin searching. Same reason, using social media is an awesome option. If you live in a semi-populated area, chances are your neighborhood either has a Facebook page or uses the Nextdoor app. I love the Nextdoor app. I think it's like the greatest wildlife photography tool on earth, even though it was not made to be a wildlife photography tool at all. So it's an app that we have here in the US, and I'm sure in other countries you've got different variations, where you join the app and you join your neighborhood. And all the people who live in your neighborhood are part of now this little social media that you can use to talk about just general goings-ons. Somebody can post in there and say, hey, just a heads up, neighbors, someone stole an Amazon package off my porch last night. Or, hey, neighbors, I need to borrow a snowblower. Does anybody have one I can come by and grab? People also love to post their wildlife sightings on their Nextdoor apps. It's so common for somebody to post something like, hey, neighbors, I saw a fox in my backyard yesterday around 10 p.m. So just as a heads up, if you have any outdoor cats or small dogs, keep an eye on your pets. There's a fox in the area. Or they'll post something like, hey, the deer ate my flowers again. What can I do to repel the deer from getting into my garden? To me, that's a gold mine. That's now a confirmation that there is wild animals in this certain neighborhood. The first thing I do when I'm traveling anywhere for any purpose is join the neighborhood of the place that I'm staying in on Nextdoor app and just browse for wildlife postings. I actually just found out this morning, I'm currently in central Salt Lake City, and I just found out that there's a beaver in a river about 2 blocks from where I am because I was just aimlessly scrolling through the Nextdoor neighborhood app. Again, Facebook pages for neighborhoods can be another fantastic place to start. People love to post where they've seen wildlife sightings, and it can really be helpful for you for dialing in an area to go look. Now, one of my favorite tips, and something that I think might have a weird taboo around it for some reason, is photographing captive wildlife. I heavily encourage people, especially people who are just starting out, to look around and find wildlife preserves, wildlife rehabilitation centers, and wildlife rescue centers nearby that allow people to come in, bring cameras, and take photos of the animals. This serves multiple fantastic purposes. For you, you get the opportunity to photograph an animal that's probably not going to run away, that's probably not going to be stressed out by your presence, and that's probably going to give you a lot of very relaxed behavior to the point where you can spend 10 minutes trying to angle and frame your shot better and practice any settings techniques that you really want to dial in so that you're sharp and precise next time you go out into the field. The other fantastic thing is most of these facilities either charge an entry fee or an extra entry fee for people who want to take photos of the animals. And it's a great way to give back to these local centers. I have no qualms paying a $50 photography fee at a rehabilitation center if it means that that money is going to help, further rescue other wild animals or take better care of the wild animals that they do have in captivity. I do caution people to really look into the captive wildlife centers that you're considering shooting at. There are some dark pasts from an ethical standpoint with some zoos, particularly roadside zoos, or anything that's almost, that guarantees encounters where you can hold or pet an animal or get really, really close to an animal or something like that. Those places are typically not very ethical and don't treat their wild subjects as well as we might hope they would. So do your research before patronizing any of these places. But if it is a true preserve or rehabilitation center or rescue center, for the most part, you can find some great credentials on their website. You can do your background research and know that you're not supporting anything nefarious and have some awesome, super easy opportunities to take pictures of wild animals. Now, the most advanced method would be tracking your wild subjects. Tracking is an art form, just like photography, that requires just as much background knowledge, training, time in the field, and all of that. It's definitely not necessarily the easiest method to pick up as a beginner. So for any beginners out there, when you're first breaking into wildlife photography, I recommend all of the other options before diving straight into tracking. But if it is something that interests you, highly encourage watching YouTube videos, purchasing books, educating yourself about all the different signs that animals leave on the environment that might help you dial in where they're hanging out or where they hang out frequently. And last of all, luck is tremendous. Luck is like everything in wildlife photography. I have really bad luck. You wouldn't really think that when you look at my images. It looks like I'm very often in the right place at the right time. The truth is, I'd say less than 80% of the times that I go out with the intention of shooting wildlife, do I actually successfully find an animal? And then I'd say maybe only 5% of that 20% of the time that I'm seeing wildlife, am I getting a good image? And then maybe 1% of those 5% is a great image. So just remembering that luck is a huge part of this, and it might not be your own fault when you're not having success in finding a subject. And not getting discouraged by that either is a huge part of wildlife photography. The journey to finding your subject is honestly one of the most fun parts. So just keep in mind, don't get frustrated, be patient, keep trying. Eventually luck will be on your side, I promise. This is another photo of another time that I was waiting for wolves like a year later after the first encounter and ended up shooting nothing but ravens. So just another great reminder that nothing is mundane. You can have fun with anything wild. So the reason I don't talk about gear very often is also because I think that you can shoot with anything. And as long as your composition is a great composition, you're going to get a great image. When you're shooting wildlife, it can be so exciting when you first find your subject. To this day, no matter how much experience I get or how much time I spend with wild animals, when I see an animal after hours of looking for one, or days or months or weeks, my first reaction of finally seeing one is just, there it is. Get my camera in position. Take a bajillion photos. That's not going to get you a good photo. That's going to get you a picture that certainly proves you saw your subject, but it's probably not going to be an image that you want to hang on your wall, or that's going to look much different from anybody else's photo of that specific animal. The biggest thing that I can implore you to do when you find your subject is slow down. Fire off that excited burst of images, then take a step back, physically, literally take a step back, pull yourself out of the moment a little bit, and start to think about what your best composition is going to be. Get eye level. I cannot state this enough. Do whatever it takes to get eye level with your subject. This photo here, this bear was in a tree. I was holding my camera up above my head so that I wasn't shooting down up into the bear's face. Getting eye level provides just this intimate connection with your wild subject. It's a little bit different than anything you'll ever experience with your naked eye, because if you're eye level with a bear at what this closeness and intimacy might be, you're probably not in a very safe position. So getting eye level and utilizing the maximum reach of your telephoto lens can really help create these awesome portrait style images. Next compositional point is subject isolation. I say this all the time. The biggest thing in wildlife photography, aside from getting eye level, is subject isolation. Animals were meant to camouflage with each other and with their environment. Isolating the animal that you want as your target subject any way you possibly can, whether that's by changing your position or shooting with a wide aperture, will help your subject stand out against their backdrop so that your image is more interesting than when they just blend into the background. So for the settings, like I mentioned, wide aperture is essential in my opinion. Pro capture mode, if you have it on your camera, is an absolute lifesaver. I live in pro capture mode so that I can capture the moment that I'm hoping for. And then just be playful, push the limits. I don't give people a set of baseline settings that I think you should use and work up or down from there. Use whatever the heck it takes to get a photo. This image was taken with ISO 2000. I've actually heard photographers on teachings and presentations say like, never shoot higher than ISO 1000, or I've even heard people say higher than ISO 800. And I think that's entirely wrong. Push your settings as far as you have to get the image. It might come out better than you anticipated, or you might just be able to clean it up a little bit in post-production. I use noise reduction on the backdrop of this photo here to smooth out the minimal grain that I got shooting at such a high ISO. And I can't imagine passing up an opportunity to photograph an animal just because you can't use your ideal pre-envisioned preset settings. So be playful, push the limits, make the most of the opportunity. This is one of my other favorite photos that I've ever taken in my life. But I want to show you what this scene looked like when I originally arrived. So I was driving to my friend's cabin up in the mountains to go over for dinner. I had my camera with me, which was very lucky. When I actually first pulled onto the dirt road where he lives, this is what I saw. I saw a moose. I got really excited because I hadn't seen a moose in weeks, and I was not expecting to see one right in front of my friend's cabin. So I pulled over on the side of the road. I started taking 1,000 photos of the moose. This was one of those 1,000 photos. As you can see, it's not a good image. The light was so harsh that my camera couldn't properly focus on a super dark moose. There is absolutely nothing interesting about this photo, other than the fact that it has a moose in it. The backdrop isn't wonderful. There's all sorts of man-made objects. The moose is blurry. He's not very well isolated against the backdrop of the hill behind him. Finally, I reminded myself to slow the heck down, think about what I'm doing, try to maximize this moment. As you can see from the light in this photo, the sun was setting behind me and kind of casting the subject into this golden light. So I very slowly drove my car onto the dirt road behind the sagebrush behind him and positioned myself so that I was shooting into the setting sun. That's what gave this backlit scene, lit up the mosquitoes that were swarming around the moose. Because I had been driving around in a circle around the moose on this dirt road, it kicked up all this dust into the air, and that's what gave that hazy backdrop effect. And because I slowed down and thought about my composition, I went from a scene like this to a scene like that. Slow down, think very carefully about how you can maximize the moment, and you might surprise yourself with how you can salvage an image and how great of a picture you can get in a less than ideal environment. Now, in the interest of time, I won't go too far into this because I do want to open this up to some Q&A for you guys. But I always think it's really important to mention the ethics of wildlife photography. As wildlife photographers, our second duty is to get a great image of animals, but our first duty is to keep the wild, both for ourselves so that we can continue to go out and shoot and take great photos of animals that aren't stressed out, but even more importantly, for the sake of our subjects. I assume you're doing wildlife photography because you love wild animals. So it's important to treat those animals like you would anything else you love, and that's with the utmost respect. Use a telephoto lens. Using a telephoto lens enables you to maintain a safe distance away from your subject. Be aware of the body language from the animals that indicate you might be getting too close or your presence might be making them uncomfortable. You might have to sit down and do some research. I'm going to talk really quickly in a moment here about some of that important body language that I think everyone should be aware of. Making sure that you're reading your subject and backing off or entirely leaving when they get uncomfortable is very important. In some areas, there are laws that prohibit you from getting too close. In parts of Alaska, you're able to approach a brown bear within up to 30 yards. However, in the lower 48, if you're shooting in Yellowstone or Grand Teton National Park, legally, you may never get closer than 1,000 or 100 yards of a bear. So knowing the laws and where they differ depending on where you're shooting will help you also have guidelines to maintain the proper distance from your subject. Don't feed wild animals. It can be tempting. I know, everybody knows it can be tempting to try to bait an animal to get closer to you by tossing them a sandwich or a Cheeto or a hot dog. Just don't do it. It's not safe for the animal. It's not safe for the people. There's a whole different slew of problems that can arise. I live by the saying that a fed bear is a dead bear. A fed fox is a dead fox. It applies to all mammals. Obviously, songbirds that eat off of a bird feeder is a little bit of a different circumstance, but if you're ever unsure, opt to not feed your subject. Understand your impact on both the animal and the environment where you're shooting. If you're shooting elk or deer on a fragile tundra ecosystem, know where it's smart to walk, know where walking might impact the local plants. Be very conscious of your place in nature and how you might affect the area that you're at. And then just stay informed of wildlife nesting and breeding behaviors. Photographing birds during nesting season can be very stressful to them. They're trying to keep baby birds alive, and your presence can definitely pressure them and make them not care as well for their eggs or their babies as they should be able to when they're undisturbed. And knowing about breeding behaviors will help you avoid aggressive wildlife. Right now is bear mating season. It's not the best time to get all willy-nilly when you're trying to photograph bears. I included this photo of this grizzly bear catching a fish here because of one very important detail. If you look closely at his eyes and the way that he's looking, he's presenting a behavior, a facial expression that we call in wildlife photography whale eyes. He looks like an orca whale rolling the whites of his eyes. You can see he's looking off to the side. The whites of his eyes are very visible. And he's got the expression of an intimidated, uncomfortable animal. Anybody here who owns a dog is probably very familiar with this facial expression. When you yell at your dog for doing something bad, I guarantee, pay attention, they're going to do that whale eye look as they sort of hide their face in shame and fear. Almost every wild species that I photograph, from deer to bears to foxes, exhibit this whale-eyed posture when they're uncomfortable. This bear, what was actually happening just out of frame, was another bear, a larger bear, was approaching to attempt to steal this bear's fish, which is why it was doing that whale-eyed gesture or posture. But more often than not, when you see a photo like this where the subject is whale-eyed, it's because it's uncomfortable with the photographer or the photographer's proximity to that subject. So that's my favorite uncomfortable animal wildlife behavior that I think new photographers should keep out or keep an eye out for. The second you see that whale-eyed posture, it's a good time to step back or leave the scene. This is an example of an animal that was clearly incredibly uncomfortable with me getting close. This mountain goat would not allow me to get within even 100 yards of it. So I had to get creative because I didn't want to lose the opportunity to still take a photo. I had to stand really far back and think about how I could still compose a shot. Just as a reminder that you don't always have to be super close to your subject to get a great photo. I was able to utilize the high contrast of the mountain goat against his environment to still walk away with a great picture. It wasn't the portrait that I had envisioned or set out to take, but I think actually in this case, the photo that I did get was way more interesting than what I was envisioning, and I respected the mountain goat's space. I like to end on this quote here. It's from the late Steve Irwin. "If we can teach people about wildlife, they will be touched. Share my wildlife with me because people want to save what they love. Dive head over heels into wildlife photography. Show me, show your friends, show people the images of the animals that you adore. Chances are, as you dive deeper and deeper and show more and more people what you're working on, they're going to fall in love with these animals too. And they're going to want to protect and care for and respect the animals that you obviously love so much." So without further ado, this is the last image here that I'm going to talk about. This is a photo that I took recently of a wild grizzly bear doing yoga. It was a time that I kind of did have to get a little bit creative about the composition. This bear, she had a very dark coat and she was posing on a very light backdrop. So I had to play a little bit more with my settings than what I usually do to make the bear really stand out in that high contrast with that all white backdrop, and got a fun, silly picture of her doing yoga. So with that picture up, let's move on into question and answer. I hope I didn't glaze over anything that you guys wanted more detail on, but ask away whatever you might have. Let's talk.
Hey, Brooke. So
Hey.
I just want to apologize in advance. We've had a little Wi-Fi issues tonight. Thank you guys for sticking it out with us. We still got a lot of people on here, and we're going to get to Q&A. I do apologize for a couple of those little hiccups we had, but overall, great performance, Brooke. Thank you for all these awesome tips and super helpful feedback, or tips and tricks. I do have, there's a whole bunch of questions in here we need to answer, but there was one that came up a while ago that I want to make sure I check in on. Anybody or somebody wanted to know if you shoot with a photography box, and I've been following your Instagram stories and didn't know if you wanted to share about, is it the mountain lion you're trying to get?
Yes, I will tell you guys all about my mountain lion. I am in the midst of a very ambitious wildlife photography project right now. I'm trying to get a photo of a mountain lion. I realize it's never going to happen with me shooting face to face because mountain lions are so elusive. So I actually, with the help of some friends, rigged up a box that I can put my camera in, and it has a motion sensor attached to it. And the motion sensor is plugged into the camera to work as a remote shutter, so that when a mountain lion walks by and triggers the motion sensor, it'll take a photo. The mountain lion that I've been tracking and targeting is the smartest, most cattiest cat on planet Earth. He has twice now knocked over my camera. He's walked from behind so that it didn't trigger my motion sensor and just knocked my whole camera right over. Then he got even worse. He tormented even more. Last week, he walked right up to my camera and he sat down right next to my lens. I have the 17 millimeter Olympus lens in there because since it's a remote camera, you know, the mountain lion's going to get really close to it. He sat right next to my lens, just outside of the field of view, to the point where I had one corner of his ear and his cheek in frame, and that was it. And sat there for like 5 minutes, just grooming himself, licking his paws. Then he walked behind the camera, knocked over my motion sensor, and then stuck his face right into the camera lens. Now I know he's doing this because I have a trail camera, one of those motion sensored hunting camera that's like low resolution on a tree, just watching the setup. So I get these torturous, low quality videos of the mountain lion toying with me. But I guarantee you guys, within this calendar year, I will have a photo of a mountain lion. No matter what it takes, it's going to happen eventually.
As soon as I saw that comment come through, I was like, oh, she has a story about this. I've been following all of those Instagram stories you post about that mountain lion. And I'm like, poor Brooke, she's trying so hard.
If anybody here owns a cat, this mountain lion is probably exactly like your domestic cat. He just walks up and knocks over everything in his path.
All right, so we have a question from YouTube. For the moose shots, did you use your car as a blind or did you shoot in front of or from inside your car? Do you ever shoot inside of your car? I cannot talk tonight, guys. Sorry.
Yeah, I shoot from inside my car a lot, especially when it's a wildlife or an animal that's on the roadside. A lot of times you'll pull up in your car and the second you get out, the animal like sees the human shape and bolts. So using your car as a hide or a blind is like a total pro hack. I stayed in my car so that I was able to slowly circle that moose without him getting spooked. If I tried to do that on foot, he would have been long gone.
Awesome. And I don't know about this because I've never asked you before, but do you typically use any sort of photo filters when you shoot?
So I don't. It's not for lack of wanting or for lack of thinking that they're necessary. I think filters would be super helpful. Because I have very minimal background in landscape photography, personally, I'm not sure how filters work or like where to begin in the selection of a filter. So I don't use them personally. I plan to eventually learn how, and I have a lot of friends who do and are very successful. So if you've got the filters, use them the same way that you would for landscape. It'll still help create a great composition. I just personally don't have experience with them.
Awesome. Okay, and I think I do know that you have an answer to this, but do you have a recommendation for any books on tracking? Yes. I swear you showed me one the other day when we were talking.
Yes, I do. I am reading a fantastic tracking book right now. It is called Wildlife Track and Sign of North America by Mark Elbrock. Write down the name Mark Elbrock. He writes all sorts of fantastic books about wildlife behavior, wildlife tracking, mammal tracking, bird tracking, everything you could want to know about your wild subjects. He's like the holy grail of those textbooks. So definitely recommend the Wildlife Track and Sign by Mark Elbrock for the most comprehensive textbook on wilderness tracking.
I knew you were going to have an answer for that one. All right. And do you crop your images in to make them more portrait-like?
Yes. I love this question. Thank you, John, for asking that. I should have included this in my overall presentation. I am a huge fan of cropping, and I encourage any wildlife photographers to crop to your heart's content. There's this weird taboo for some reason that I don't know why it exists, where people think that cropping a photo in wildlife photography is cheating, which is so ridiculous because, like I mentioned, your goal as a wildlife photographer is to keep the wild wild. So it's to keep a respectful distance from your subject. Use any tool in your toolkit to stay as far away as you can. while still getting those intimate photos. So using a great telephoto lens and then cropping your images is like the way to go. I've heard a saying before, and this doesn't apply in all circumstances, but for the most part, if your subject fills the frame without cropping, there's a chance you might be too close. So maybe reevaluate your positioning and your stance. More often than not, you want your subject with a little bit of distance and then crop in. So I do it all the time. Almost every single one of my photos is going to be cropped to some marginal degrees. Some are crazy degrees. And I encourage people to just crop to whatever you're comfortable with.
Follow-up question. How much time do you spend in post-production? Do you have to spend a lot of time editing your images, or do you have kind of a quick, secret recipe that you whip together?
It depends. There are some photos that I've spent upwards of like 5 hours on because the photo was really messy. The subject wasn't as isolated from the backdrop as I wanted. The light was horrible. And it was a really cool, unique moment that I didn't want to just throw away. So I spent a ton of time. Actually, that bear catching a fish that I showed earlier, that was one of those images that took hours and hours of editing. It was just a great moment of this bear with this fish in its mouth, but I was on a dock and there was all this ocean spray, so my photo wasn't super clear, and the bear was moving really fast because he was scared of the bear approaching, so he was kind of blurry. So I had to do a lot of work to clean that photo up. But other times, if my shoot goes really well and my atmosphere and everything is the way that I like it, sometimes all I have to do is crop a photo, maybe adjust the levels a little bit if I want to, and I'm good to go. So anything from like 30 seconds to 5 hours is the answer to that question.
There's like no middle ground there. That was
no. And actually it's funny. There really isn't much of a middle ground I've found. It's either like a really fantastic image or an image that requires a lot of work. It's just whatever amount of work you're willing to put in is what I think should govern people's post-processing.
Yeah, I agree. Somebody asked if you can handheld, I assume hand hold while using Pro Capture. Yes,
you can, which is crazy. I am telling you, when people ask me how Pro Capture mode works, my answer is I have no idea. It's magic, but all I know is that it works great. You can handhold. I never take a tripod with me on wildlife shoots. I actually don't own a tripod other than the one that I have on my little remote camera trap, which I might just ditch anyway since the mountain lion keeps knocking it over. I might as well just put the camera on the ground.
Smart mountain lion. Okay. Oh gosh, sorry. All the comments just blew through really quick.
I love people's questions. So
yeah, I just want to make sure I get caught up to where I was. Sorry, guys. Do you use camo on your lens or on yourself?
So I don't use camo on my lens, mainly just because I'm so weird. I think that Olympus cameras are like beautiful from like a design standpoint, as weird as that sounds. I've ordered these camouflage like stickers that go over the open space on the lenses, like right there and here and stuff. I don't want to put them on because I love the look of my gear. I do wear camo though. I know that it doesn't always work for all animal species. There are some that are so like bears, you don't really need camouflage because their vision is as good as ours, but their sense of smell is better than a bloodhound. So like they're going to know you're around no matter what you're wearing. But I do, for the most part, just wear it as default in case there's an animal on the environment that is susceptible to the wearing of camo.
Right. They can smell your sandwich, those bears.
Right.
They know what you ate yesterday.
They know everything.
What photo editing software do you use? What is your, oh, there you are. Sorry, you cut out for a sec.
So I'm not the most technologically brilliant person. You could probably tell when I was talking about the gear. So I keep it simple. I just use Adobe Lightroom. I barely ever open up Photoshop or anything more advanced than that. I think Lightroom can do all the easy stuff that I need, and then it can do the advanced stuff that I need. So it's more than enough for me.
To go along with that, is that what you use to remove noise? There was a question about what you use to remove noise. Do you just do it in Lightroom?
Yep, I do it in Lightroom. There's also a new software called Topaz Sharpen and Denoise AI that a lot of my colleagues use. And I just downloaded it and tested it for like the first time this past week. And I really like it. So it might be worth looking into Topaz Denoise. But I'm not like proficient at it yet. So for the most part, I'm still living entirely in Lightroom.
All right. And we got one question about how do you find the owl nests? Was that one of your next door finds, or did you just happen to stumble upon that?
So that's almost always a next door find, or eBird. eBird is another really great crowdsourcing app that you can download. They don't typically list protected species, so your great gray owls or your more sensitive to human presence bird species aren't going to be on eBird. But for like great horned owls, barred owls, things like that, it's a great little app that you can just download. You can search literally owls near me the same way you'd search fast food near me. And it'll give you a general area where you can start your search. When I'm not getting my owl nests using those apps, I use tracking methods like just keeping an eye out for feathers on the ground, owl pellets, owl scat, and all those other indicators on the environment.
I wondered if you were going to talk about scat today. I knew it was coming. I just had to wait long enough.
I had a promise to myself that I wasn't going to talk about animal poop, and I just broke it.
I knew it was going to come, but I didn't know it was going to be at the very end. I thought that you would slip in scat somewhere else.
I actually challenged myself to go 1 hour of my life without talking about owl or animal poop, and I failed.
I will say I've been following Brooke's Instagram forever. And don't follow her if you are afraid to learn about animal poop, because there's a lot of information about animal poop on there, but lots of great information.
I love to show off animal poop because it's like reading a book. Looking at an animal's scat tells you what animals have been in an area and what they've been up to. You can learn what they've been eating, what they haven't been eating, where they have been going, where they haven't been going, how frequently they're going there. It's truly like the most fun side project having to do with wildlife photography.
Sorry, guys. That was good. All right. Last one. Well, what do you use? Manual, aperture, or shutter priority? And I know you did talk about this briefly, but is there one of those that you tend to prefer or default to?
Yeah. Man, I rotate between all of them probably evenly. My answer to this used to be that I lived in aperture priority primarily, and then I did a little test to see if I was being honest about that. And I actually am even. All of my photos come equally from manual to aperture to shutter. It depends on the situation. If I'm going for a photo that I want to have that high contrast, strong subject isolation, very blurry background, very sharp animal, I'll stick in aperture mode. So that way I can guarantee that I'm shooting with that wide open aperture that I prefer. If I'm trying to capture something more behavioral, like an animal on the move or an animal doing a behavior that only happens for like 1 split second, like a bird blinking, I'm living in shutter priority. Manual, I'll shoot in if I have more time with my subject. So if it's like a fox that I know lingers in one location for a long time, or a moose or an elk grazing, and I know that animal is not going to bolt anytime soon, and I have time to really, really slow down and control my settings, that's when I'll be in manual mode. Or if the weather is bad, if the clouds are moving quickly and the light is changing constantly, I'll just stay in manual so I can control everything. Or if it's snowing or raining heavily, I'll stay in manual to anticipate what the weather is going to change to next as well. But really, I use all of them unanimously, just kind of depending on what shot I have in mind.
That makes sense. And then I know I said that was the last one, but there's been a couple of questions about your autofocus preferences. Do you have like a target mode that's your favorite, or do you use continuous autofocus or single? And I know that varies too. I'm notorious for that. I kind of go back and forth with what I like.
I go back and forth. I think I just wake up each morning and change my mind on how I want to do things. For like 3 months, I lived in the tracking mode that the EM1 Mark III offers, where it locks onto your subject, and as they move, it tracks them throughout the image. That was like the only focus mode that I ever touched. Then all of a sudden, I rediscovered continuous autofocus, which is like the simplified version of that, where it's just refocusing on the animal as it moves or as I change my camera around. And now currently that's my preference. Sometimes I will use single autofocus if I'm trying to focus on an animal, like a certain part of its body, and the camera doesn't know what I have in mind. And I'm using my little joystick on the back screen to change my focus point onto that specific targeted moment. So I really don't find that any mode is like more beneficial to me than another. Again, it just has to do with like what I have envisioned for the shot that I want to walk away with.
That checks out. All right. Well, I do want to say a quick thank you to everyone that's joined us. And as always, the comment section was a frenzy tonight. It always is. It's hard to keep up with you guys. You asked lots of questions. But again, thank you all down in the comment section for helping out other people, answering their questions. It's always lovely to see the community banding together and helping out someone when they're asking questions when we're going through this. I love seeing all the comments. Seriously, reading your guys' comments while we're doing this is the greatest because it's like teamwork down there in the comment section. You guys are my favorite. And I just want to thank Brooke for your time tonight. Thank you for sitting with me and doing all of this and putting together this presentation, even though you have a road trip planned for tonight. I can't thank you enough for your time tonight.
Yeah, thank you so much for having me. And a special thank you for everybody who tuned in. I love people who take time out of their day to learn more about the things they're interested in, especially when it's wildlife photography. I appreciate your attendance a ton. I also love to interact with people. So if there were any questions that you had that you didn't get to answer or ask during the session, shoot me a message on Instagram. Like I said, it's just Brooke Little Bear. It's super easy to find me. I'm very conversational. So I'll keep an eye out tonight and tomorrow to see if anyone pops in with any questions or just follow-up discussions, or if you just want to show me cool pictures of animals you took. I love that too.
And for everybody else that's hanging out in 2 weeks' time, because we do Home with Olympus on Thursday nights, every other Thursday night, and I always say that wrong. So to clarify, not this Thursday, but next Thursday, we'll be back again with another wildlife feature. We're going to be doing a community feature with some of our community photographers. That's people like you that are down there in the comment section, helping other people out and answering all the questions, being the MVPs. So next or 2 weeks from now, on Thursday night, we'll be doing our community feature, Home with Olympus and Me. It is going to be focused on wildlife and nature photography. We're going to get some tips and tricks from various photographers out there in the Olympus universe, which is always a lot of fun. And I will bid you all a good night. And thank you so much for joining us. Have a good night, everyone.